Deep work. Part 3. Deep work helps you quickly learn hard things.
Let your mind become a lens, thanks to the converging rays of attention. Let your soul be all intent on whatever it is that is established in your mind as a dominant, wholly absorbing idea. This advice comes from Antonin Dalmas Sertalanges, a Dominican friar and professor of moral philosophy, who during the early part of the 20th century penned a slim but influential volume titled The Intellectual Life. Sertalanges wrote the book as a guide to the development and deepening of the mind, for those called to make a living in the world of ideas. Throughout The Intellectual Life, Sertalanges recognizes the necessity of mastering complicated material and helps prepare the reader for this challenge. For this reason, his book proves useful in our quest to better understand how people quickly master hard, cognitive skills. To understand Sertalanges' advice, let's return to the quote from earlier. In these words, which are echoed in many forms in The Intellectual Life, Sertalanges argues that to advance your understanding of your field you must tackle the relevant topics systematically, allowing your converging rays of attention to uncover the truth latent in each. In other words, he teaches, to learn requires intense concentration. This idea turns out to be ahead of its time. In reflecting on the life of the mind in the 1920s, Sertalanges uncovered a fact about mastering cognitively demanding tasks that would take academia another 7 decades to formalize. This task of formalization began in earnest in the 1970s, when a branch of psychology, sometimes called performance psychology, began to systematically explore what separates experts, in many different fields, from everyone else. In the early 1990s, K. Anders Ericsson, a professor at Florida State University, pulled together these strands into a single coherent answer, consistent with the growing research literature, that he gave a punchy name, deliberate practice. Ericsson opens his seminal paper on the topic with a powerful claim: we deny that these differences, between expert performers and normal adults, are immutable. Instead, we argue that the differences between expert performers and normal adults reflect a lifelong period of deliberate effort to improve performance in a specific domain. American culture, in particular, loves the storyline of the prodigy. Do you know how easy this is for me? Matt Damon's character famously cries in the movie Good Will Hunting as he makes quick work of proofs that stymie the world's top mathematicians. The line of research promoted by Ericsson, and now widely accepted, with caveats asterisk, destabilizes these myths. To master a cognitively demanding task requires this specific form of practice. There are few exceptions made for natural talent. On this point too, Sertalanges seems to have been ahead of his time, arguing in The Intellectual Life, men of genius themselves were great only by bringing all their power to bear on the point on which they had decided to show their full measure. Ericsson couldn't have said it better. This brings us to the question of what deliberate practice actually requires. Its core components are usually identified as follows. 1. Your attention is focused tightly on a specific skill you're trying to improve or an idea you're trying to master. 2. You receive feedback so you can correct your approach to keep your attention exactly where it's most productive. The first component is of particular importance to our discussion, as it emphasizes that deliberate practice cannot exist alongside distraction, and that it instead requires uninterrupted concentration. As Ericsson emphasizes, diffused attention is almost antithetical to the focused attention required by deliberate practice. Emphasis mine. As psychologists, Ericsson and the other researchers in his field are not interested in why deliberate practice works. They're just identifying it as an effective behavior. In the intervening decades since Ericsson's first major papers on the topic, however, neuroscientists have been exploring the physical mechanisms that drive people's improvements on hard tasks. As the journalist Daniel Coyle surveys in his 2009 book, The Talent Code, these scientists increasingly believe the answer includes myelin, a layer of fatty tissue that grows around neurons, acting like an insulator that allows the cells to fire faster and cleaner. To understand the role of myelin in improvement, keep in mind that skills, be they intellectual or physical, eventually reduce down to brain circuits. This new science of performance argues that you get better at a skill as you develop more myelin around the relevant neurons, allowing the corresponding circuit to fire more effortlessly and effectively. To be great at something is to be well myelinated. This understanding is important because it provides a neurological foundation for why deliberate practice works. By focusing intensely on a specific skill, you're forcing the specific relevant circuit to fire, again and again, in isolation. This repetitive use of a specific circuit triggers cells called oligodendrocytes to begin wrapping layers of myelin around the neurons in the circuits, effectively cementing the skill. The reason, therefore, why it's important to focus intensely on the task at hand while avoiding distraction, is because this is the only way to isolate the relevant neural circuit enough to trigger useful myelination. By contrast, if you're trying to learn a complex new skill, say, SQL database management, in a state of low concentration, perhaps you also have your Facebook feed open, you're firing too many circuits simultaneously and haphazardly to isolate the group of neurons you actually want to strengthen. In the century that has passed since Antonin Dalmas Sertalanges first wrote about using the mind like a lens to focus rays of attention, we have advanced from this elevated metaphor to a decidedly less poetic explanation, expressed in terms of oligodendrocyte cells. But this sequence of thinking about thinking points to an inescapable conclusion: to learn hard things quickly, you must focus intensely without distraction. To learn, in other words, is an act of deep work. If you're comfortable going deep, you'll be comfortable mastering the increasingly complex systems and skills needed to thrive in our economy. If you instead remain one of the many for whom depth is uncomfortable and distraction ubiquitous, you shouldn't expect these systems and skills to come easily to you.
Deep work helps you produce at an elite level.
Adam Grant produces at an elite level. When I met Grant in 2013, he was the youngest professor to be awarded tenure at the Wharton School of Business at Penn. A year later, when I started writing this chapter, and was just beginning to think about my own tenure process, the claim was updated: he's now the youngest full professor at Wharton. The reason Grant advanced so quickly in his corner of academia is simple: he produces. In 2012, Grant published 7 articles, all of them in major journals. This is an absurdly high rate for his field, in which professors tend to work alone or in small professional collaborations and do not have large teams of students and postdocs to support their research. In 2013, this count fell to 5. This is still absurdly high, but below his recent standards. He can be excused for this dip, however, because this same year he published a book titled Give and Take, which popularized some of his research on relationships in business. To say that this book was successful is an understatement. It ended up featured on the cover of the New York Times Magazine and went on to become a massive bestseller. When Grant was awarded full professorship in 2014, he had already written more than 60 peer-reviewed publications in addition to his best-selling book. Soon after meeting Grant, my own academic career on my mind, I couldn't help but ask him about his productivity. Fortunately for me, he was happy to share his thoughts on the subject. It turns out that Grant thinks a lot about the mechanics of producing at an elite level. He sent me, for example, a collection of PowerPoint slides from a workshop he attended with several other professors in his field. The event was focused on data-driven observations about how to produce academic work at an optimum rate. These slides included detailed pie charts of time allocation per season, a flowchart capturing relationship development with co-authors, and a suggested reading list with more than 20 titles. These business professors do not live the cliché of the absent-minded academic lost in books and occasionally stumbling on a big idea. They see productivity as a scientific problem to systematically solve, a goal Adam Grant seems to have achieved. Though Grant's productivity depends on many factors, there's one idea in particular that seems central to his method: the batching of hard but important intellectual work into long, uninterrupted stretches. Grant performs this batching at multiple levels. Within the year, he stacks his teaching into the fall semester, during which he can turn all of his attention to teaching well and being available to his students. This method seems to work, as Grant is currently the highest-rated teacher at Wharton and the winner of multiple teaching awards. By batching his teaching in the fall, Grant can then turn his attention fully to research in the spring and summer, and tackle this work with less distraction. Grant also batches his attention on a smaller time scale. Within a semester dedicated to research, he alternates between periods where his door is open to students and colleagues, and periods where he isolates himself to focus completely and without distraction on a single research task. He typically divides the writing of a scholarly paper into 3 discrete tasks: analyzing the data, writing a full draft, and editing the draft into something publishable. During these periods, which can last up to 3 or 4 days, he'll often put an out-of-office autoresponder on his email so correspondents will know not to expect a response. "It sometimes confuses my colleagues," he told me. "They say, 'You're not out of office, I see you in your office right now.'" But to Grant, it's important to enforce strict isolation until he completes the task at hand. My guess is that Adam Grant doesn't work substantially more hours than the average professor at an elite research institution. Generally speaking, this is a group prone to workaholism, but he still manages to produce more than just about anyone else in his field. I argue that his approach to batching helps explain this paradox. In particular, by consolidating his work into intense and uninterrupted pulses, he's leveraging the following law of productivity. If you believe this formula, then Grant's habits make sense. By maximizing his intensity when he works, he maximizes the results he produces per unit of time spent working. This is not the first time I've encountered this formulaic conception of productivity. It first came to my attention when I was researching my second book, How to Become a Straight-A Student, many years earlier. During that research process, I interviewed around 50 ultra-high-scoring college undergraduates from some of the country's most competitive schools. Something I noticed in these interviews is that the very best students often studied less than the group of students right below them on the GPA rankings. One of the explanations for this phenomenon turned out to be the formula detailed earlier. The best students understood the role intensity plays in productivity and therefore went out of their way to maximize their concentration, radically reducing the time required to prepare for tests or write papers, without diminishing the quality of their results. The example of Adam Grant implies that this intensity formula applies beyond just undergraduate GPA, and is also relevant to other cognitively demanding tasks. But why would this be? An interesting explanation comes from Sophie Leroy, a business professor at the University of Minnesota. In a 2009 paper, titled, intriguingly, "Why is it so hard to do my work?" Leroy introduced an effect she called attention residue. In the introduction to this paper, she noted that other researchers have studied the effect of multitasking, trying to accomplish multiple tasks simultaneously, on performance, but that in the modern knowledge work office, once you got to a high enough level, it was more common to find people working on multiple projects sequentially, going from one meeting to the next. Starting to work on one project and soon after having to transition to another is just part of life in organizations, Leroy explains. The problem this research identifies with this work strategy is that when you switch from some task A to another task B, your attention doesn't immediately follow. A residue of your attention remains stuck thinking about the original task. This residue gets especially thick if your work on task A was unbounded and of low intensity before you switched. But even if you finish task A before moving on, your attention remains divided for a while. Leroy studied the effect of this attention residue on performance by forcing task switches in the laboratory. In one such experiment, for example, she started her subjects working on a set of word puzzles. In one of the trials, she would interrupt them and tell them that they needed to move on to a new and challenging task, in this case, reading resumes and making hypothetical hiring decisions. In other trials, she let the subjects finish the puzzles before giving them the next task. In between puzzling and hiring, she would deploy a quick lexical decision game to quantify the amount of residue left from the first task. The results from this and her similar experiments were clear. People experiencing attention residue after switching tasks are likely to demonstrate poor performance on that next task. And the more intense the residue, the worse the performance. The concept of attention residue helps explain why the intensity formula is true and therefore helps explain Grant's productivity. By working on a single hard task for a long time without switching, Grant minimizes the negative impact of attention residue from his other obligations, allowing him to maximize performance on this one task. When Grant is working for days in isolation on a paper, in other words, he's doing so at a higher level of effectiveness than the standard professor following a more distracted strategy in which the work is repeatedly interrupted by residue slathering interruptions. Even if you're unable to fully replicate Grant's extreme isolation, we'll tackle different strategies for scheduling depth in Part 2. The attention residue concept is still telling because it implies that the common habit of working in a state of semi-distraction is potentially devastating to your performance. It might seem harmless to take a quick glance at your inbox every 10 minutes or so. Indeed, many justify this behavior as better than the old practice of leaving an inbox open on the screen at all times, a strawman habit that few follow anymore. But Leroy teaches us that this is not in fact much of an improvement. That quick check introduces a new target for your attention. Even worse, by seeing messages that you cannot deal with at the moment, which is almost always the case, you'll be forced to turn back to the primary task with a secondary task left unfinished. The attention residue left by such unresolved switches dampens your performance. When we step back from these individual observations, we see a clear argument form. To produce at your peak level, you need to work for extended periods with full concentration on a single task free from distraction. Put another way, the type of work that optimizes your performance is deep work. If you're not comfortable going deep for extended periods of time, it'll be difficult to get your performance to the peak levels of quality and quantity increasingly necessary to thrive professionally. Unless your talent and skills absolutely dwarf those of your competition, the deep workers among them will outproduce you. I've now made my argument for why deep work supports abilities that are becoming increasingly important in our economy. Before we accept this conclusion, however, we must face a type of question that often arises when I discuss this topic. What about Jack Dorsey? Jack Dorsey helped found Twitter. After stepping down as CEO, he then launched the payment processing company Square. To quote a Forbes profile, he is a disruptor on a massive scale and a repeat offender. He is also someone who does not spend a lot of time in a state of deep work. Dorsey doesn't have the luxury of long periods of uninterrupted thinking because, at the time when the Forbes profile was written, he maintained management duties at both Twitter, where he remained chairman, and Square, leading to a tightly calibrated schedule that ensures that the companies have a predictable, weekly cadence, and that also ensures that Dorsey's time and attention are severely fractured. Dorsey reports, for example, that he ends the average day with 30 to 40 sets of meeting notes that he reviews and filters at night. In the small spaces between all these meetings, he believes in serendipitous availability. I do a lot of my work at stand-up tables, which anyone can come up to, Dorsey said. I get to hear all these conversations around the company. This style of work is not deep. To use a term from our previous section, Dorsey's attention residue is likely slathered on thick as he darts from one meeting to another, letting people interrupt him freely in the brief interludes in between. And yet, we cannot say that Dorsey's work is shallow, because shallow work, as defined in the introduction, is low value and easily replicable, while what Jack Dorsey does is incredibly valuable and highly rewarded in our economy. As of this writing, he was among the top 1,000 richest people in the world, with a net worth over $1.1 billion. Jack Dorsey is important to our discussion because he's an exemplar of a group we cannot ignore, individuals who thrive without depth. When I titled the motivating question of this section, "What about Jack Dorsey?" I was providing a specific example of a more general query. If deep work is so important, why are there distracted people who do well? To conclude this chapter, I want to address this question so it doesn't nag at your attention as we dive deeper into the topic of depth in the pages ahead. To start, we must first note that Jack Dorsey is a high-level executive of a large company, 2 companies, in fact. Individuals with such positions play a major role in the category of those who thrive without depth, because the lifestyle of such executives is famously and unavoidably distracted. Here's Cary Trainer, CEO of Vimeo, trying to answer the question of how long he can go without email. I can go a good solid Saturday without, well, most of the daytime without it. I mean, I'll check it, but I won't necessarily respond. At the same time, of course, these executives are better compensated and more important in the American economy today than in any other time in history. Jack Dorsey's success without depth is common at this elite level of management. Once we've stipulated this reality, we must then step back to remind ourselves that it doesn't undermine the general value of depth. Why? Because the necessity of distraction in these executives' work lives is highly specific to their particular jobs. A good chief executive is essentially a hard-to-automate decision engine, not unlike IBM's Jeopardy! Playing Watson system. They have built up a hard-won repository of experience and have honed and proved an instinct for their market. They're then presented inputs throughout the day, in the form of emails, meetings, site visits, and the like, that they must process and act on. To ask a CEO to spend 4 hours thinking deeply about a single problem is a waste of what makes him or her valuable. It's better to hire 3 smart subordinates to think deeply about the problem and then bring their solutions to the executive, for a final decision. This specificity is important because it tells us that if you're a high-level executive at a major company, you probably don't need the advice in the pages that follow. On the other hand, it also tells us that you cannot extrapolate the approach of these executives to other jobs. The fact that Dorsey encourages interruption or Cary Trainer checks his email constantly doesn't mean that you'll share their success. If you follow suit, their behaviors are characteristic of their specific roles as corporate officers. This rule of specificity should be applied to similar counterexamples that come to mind while reading the rest of this book. There are, we must continually remember, certain corners of our economy where depth is not valued. In addition to executives, we can also include, for example, certain types of salesmen and lobbyists, for whom constant connection is their most valued currency. There are even those who manage to grind out distracted success in fields where depth would help. But at the same time, don't be too hasty to label your job as necessarily non-deep. Just because your current habits make deep work difficult doesn't mean that this lack of depth is fundamental to doing your job well. In the next chapter, for example, I tell the story of a group of high-powered management consultants who were convinced that constant email connectivity was necessary for them to service their clients. When a Harvard professor forced them to disconnect more regularly, as part of a research study, they found, to their surprise, that this connectivity didn't matter nearly as much as they had assumed. The clients didn't really need to reach them at all times, and their performance as consultants improved once their attention became less fractured. Similarly, several managers I know tried to convince me that they're most valuable when they're able to respond quickly to their team's problems, preventing project logjams. They see their role as enabling others' productivity, not necessarily protecting their own. Follow-up discussions, however, soon uncovered that this gold didn't really require attention-fracturing connectivity. Indeed, many software companies now deploy the Scrum project management methodology, which replaces a lot of this ad hoc messaging with regular, highly structured, and ruthlessly efficient status meetings, often held standing up to minimize the urge to bloviate. This approach frees up more managerial time for thinking deeply about the problems their teams are tackling, often improving the overall value of what they produce. Put another way, deep work is not the only skill valuable in our economy, and it's possible to do well without fostering this ability, but the niches where this is advisable are increasingly rare. Unless you have strong evidence that distraction is important for your specific profession, you're best served, for the reasons argued earlier in this chapter, by giving serious consideration to depth.